All right, in 12.2, your text continues on its talk concerning pesticides, but I've covered a lot of it in that first section of our lecture, so I'm not going to go kind of quickly through this section of slides, but understand that if you missed that first part, you want to go back and listen to that because we really did cover a lot about pesticides. But we're going to look at some of the tables that list some of the environmental contaminants and also define some of those pesticides as well. All right, so food production chain. Looking at this slide, you can see that our chain starts with production, but also encompasses processing and distribution, then going on into either a restaurant or retail situation, and then eventually it comes to you either at that restaurant or in your home in order to produce it. And so any type of exposure along the way or anything that goes along happens or occurs during production all the way to you consuming it, there's a lot of potential for exposure to either a chemical, a contaminant, a pathogen from this very long line and chain of production. So this is that farm to fork illustration looking at this. And we have to understand all of the ways for foods to become contaminated, but also learn how we as consumers and maybe also in producers to be able to minimize our risk associated with exposure. All right, so I'm not going to read over every single one of these on this slide and the next, but this table 12.1, it gives you some of the potential environment contaminants that are circulating out there in our food supply, all the way from acrylamide to BPA that is very common amongst plastics, and then dioxin too. And it depends, remember, just like our when it comes to food additives, pesticides, nutrients, it's how often you're exposed to it, consume it, your body, your immune system, your age, life stage, are you pregnant or breastfeeding? It really does matter when it comes to your potential health adverse effect related to it. Acrylamide is one of those that I will touch on real quickly. That this is a type of chemical that is made mostly during frying foods. And it happens when that fat is at a very high temperature for a longer period of time. So that deep frying is when this acrylamide really does uh, amount up or accumulate more in these types of foods because it's made from that reaction. It is a non-carcinogen, at least for laboratory animals. We don't have it proven for humans, but we do see associations between people who consume larger amounts consistently through their lifespan of fried foods and certain types of cancers. And so it could be from acrylamide or a compound like that. There's other ones that are made from frying foods, deep frying foods. So what do we do in order to prevent this? You see on the far right hand side, it says limit your intake of deep fat fried foods, especially those that are rich in carbohydrates, because it happens to be both the fat and also that carbohydrate that come together at the high temperature for a longer period of time during deep frying that creates acrylamide. And so I want you to just continue to read through this, not necessarily memorizing it verbatim, but do read through it, have a general understanding what this is, the toxic effects to it, and some of the preventative measures that you can do as a consumer in order to limit your exposure. Again, just taking a moment here, lead and mercury. I'm going to stop here and pause for mercury. So mercury has been discussed previously within our text, but this is an environmental contaminant. For instance, if you go to Galveston and you notice some, especially around like Texas City, some of the kind of smokestacks that are going up from the industries that are out there, well, that goes up into the air and then it rains and it comes back down onto the land and then the water goes out into the sea, and that mercury that was produced from these manufacturing facilities is one of those chemicals that gets into our oceans. And then little bitty tiny, let's say amoeba, eat that or consume that mercury through the water, and then something eats that, and then something bigger eats that. And if we look at through that food chain, of course, that species of animal that is the largest is going to have a lot of that chemical such as mercury in its flesh. So the bigger the species is, the more likely it is to accumulate a larger amount of a toxin. So an example would be having or consuming a shrimp versus consuming, let's say, shark or tilefish or swordfish. Though, of course, those are very large species versus the shrimp. The shrimp's going to have a minimal amount of mercury in it compared to those larger species. And so those, especially that are more vulnerable, like very young children, our senior citizens, or those who have weakened immune systems, we want to prevent them from consuming as much of those larger species so that they don't accumulate those. Because our human body, God provided us with many different ways that our immune systems effectively prevent us from toxicities of both bacteria, pathogens, and chemicals. But if your immune system is compromised, as in the young, the very old, and those who are receiving maybe immune suppressants, then we have to be careful with all types of exposures. So this is one example. Now, so one way of reducing your exposure to chemicals that may be in our waterways is to eat smaller species of fish. Another way is to educate yourself. I encourage you to go into Texas Gaming and Wildlife.org. It will list all the different waterways where you may receive fish sources. You need to know where your fish is coming from. If you get it from HEB, it will tell you exactly where that fish came from. And you can go to that website and you can look up, hey, is this something safe for me to consume while I am pregnant, breastfeeding, or receiving chemotherapy? If it's one time you're eating it, probably not a big deal. However, if you are living on the coast, the Gulf Coast in Texas, say in Galveston, and you fish every day and you consume those fish on a regular basis, even if you're not immunocompromised or one of those life stages that are more at risk, just as being that individual who consumes it let's say several times a week, for months, for years of your life, you're more at risk than, let's say, me, who goes to Galveston on vacation and fishes and then has it cooked for me. That's not going to bother me. But it's more, again, how often and the dosage that you are consuming. So go to your Texas Parks, Games, and Wildlife website. You can look at the contaminants. It will tell you specifically, hey, this is safe. I will tell you. If you look at the Gulf of Mexico, it is going to be alarming if you are someone who really likes to fish and eat a lot of those foods. It's not something I try to purchase on a regular basis, and I'm definitely not someone to spread fear mongering, but I think as consumers we should be informed as where our fish are coming from. If it's farmed fish, you're going to be safer because those are going to be regulated, but we do need to be at least aware of those larger species, and some of the Gulf areas are where areas are really kind of compacted by a lot of manufacturing or industrial types of facilities that are really close to our waterways. That's where you're going to have more potential for issues, but you can look it up for yourself. I have already defined what a pesticide is, but it can be anything that helps to prevent pests damage. So it could be an insecticide or a fungicide, herbicide, etc., but they all target a specific type of organism. And so just because something kills a weed does not mean it will harm the human being. So it is species specific. So that should, if you understand that a chemical does not affect a certain species in the same way, just like a hormone doesn't. If I put a cow hormone, let's say milk that has a hormone in it, into my body, does not mean that hormone is going to make any response in my body. Hormones and pesticides are species specific, so a cow's hormone would potentially be destroyed within my body and not used in that same way. The EPA allows over 10,000 different types of pesticides to be used, but it doesn't mean that you're receiving all 10,000. They are going to be specifically regulated per crop. So a farmer can't just go out there and use any type of pesticide. It has to be one of the approved ones for that type of crop that's out there. Any type of new pesticide that's introduced has to go through about 10 years or close to about 10 years of research in order for it to be approved by the EPA and FDA into our type of agriculture or food production. So it is very rigorous studies in order to make sure that it is safe for human consumption. So why do we use it? We've discussed this already in order to help to increase crop yield and also able to help farmers and to keep our pests off our food, because I would like to ask you how often it is that you go to the let's say to get apple and you don't pick up an apple and look all around it to make sure that there's not a little bug bite out of it. We don't tend to buy those, and when we have those bug bites, that increases food waste because the consumer will not purchase it. So, how are those pesticides regulated by the FDA, EPA, and USDA, just to name a couple of them? But I do want you to take a moment to read through the slide or through your text and understand what the FDA is responsible for versus the EPA. And we also have the USDA, which is going to be more uh, when it comes to regulations, they're going to be more of the meat. So if you think of, if you go to, let's say, the steak section within your grocery store, you're going to see like USDA Select. They're over looking at not only the production of it, but the quality standards of it. The FDA, you're going to see a lot of pesticide regulations. You're going to see a lot of regulations over egg and some of the dairy products. And the EPA is going to be over kind of overall of the pesticide use, whether it is fresh produce or also in our food production. Sorry, in our um, food products that are processed, boxed, packaged. Okay, as I mentioned, I'm not going to read over these, but I do want you to be able, if I was to give you maybe a matching, is to look at who's in charge of regulating what. National Marine Fisheries, that's pretty obvious. They're going to be involved in that seafood inspection. We have the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms. It tells you for it itself it's going to be in alcohol. And the EPA, pesticides, and also water quality standards. So if we're looking at tap water, for instance, it's going to be EPA. Now, bottled water will be FDA because that is a packaged product. How safe are pesticides? I've already covered this in our first lecture, recorded lecture, so it's some good information to understand on that. Remember that it's the frequency and the dose and the type, so potential of that particular toxin, the concentration that is put onto that food, and then how frequently that you eat it and your susceptibility. Are you pregnant, breastfeeding, a young child, or an older adult, or immunocompromised? Our UCA pesticide data program is the one that monitors our pesticide residues, but they also are going to use other types of organizations like the FDA and the EPA. Our EPA last audit shows that about 99% of our samples tested had residues below the tolerances, and that's not organic, that's all produce. About almost half have actually no detectable or zero pesticide residues, whether they are organic or non-organic types of foods. The FDA's Total Diet Study, TDS, is the typical foods that are analyzed for any type of element or pesticides or even industrial chemicals, and it's done 4 times per year. It's going to look in different types of tissues like our lymph, our genital, brain, digestive types of cancers, anything that those nutrients would be likely to go through within your body. So obviously the digestive tract makes sense, but of course we want to look at genital, lymph node types of cancers. All of these are studied within the TDS type of research. The respiratory cancer cases increase without greater insecticide use from their last report. So it doesn't, we don't see a correlation. Glyphosate. This is, oh goodness, I could go on forever about the misinformation that's out there about glyphosate. It is one of the most common types of herbicides that's out there. It is one of the types of pesticides featured in Roundup, which gets a lot of bad rap because of their old history. However, their new products are one of the most common types of pesticides that are out there that is used in food production because of its safety, because of the human tolerance to the exposure is quite high, so we can consume a lot of it without any type of potential harm. It's able to contain the weeds and grasses, and it does so by blocking an enzyme. And that enzyme is only specific to that plant. So if we consume that enzyme, it does not destroy anything in us, just like our own enzymes do not do so, except for in order to digest foods. This enzyme will only work within a plant. So it's specific to a weed and not the plant itself, nor the human body. According to the EPA, please understand glyphosate is safe for humans if used according to the label. Again, if you were to take a whole gallon of it and put it into a jug and drink it yourself, obviously it is going to cause harm. Remember, any chemical can, even H2O, if it is consumed in excess. So it's always the dosage that makes the poison. The amount that is used and tested by various different types of agencies out there, government or non-government, have proven that it is safe for human consumption in the normal consumer use. All right, the FDA's yearly evaluation of a market basket of typical foods show, let's just say if you randomly came up to the checkout line and they did an audit on your foods, would show that the pesticide residues are minimal in the majority of the foods that are consumed, about 99% of those. And remember that we get our foods from a variety of places. So if you go to Walmart, those foods are from all different types of places, countries, states, and so you're not going to get the same exposure of any type of nutrient nor chemical, pesticide, fungicide, herbicide, and that is actually a good thing because that limits our ability to ever cross a type of threshold. Oh, that EWG, that Environmental Working Group. This is the one that produces the Dirty Dozen and that so-called Clean 15 list every year. 99% of residues on the tested produce were well below the safe threshold level set by the EPA, despite what this Environmental Working Group, and that sounds very legit too, right? But it's really just a bunch of junk. 50% of the food sampled had no detectable residues at all. So big differences from what majority of experts out there are saying versus what this particular group is that also receives compensation from certain types of manufacturers for. Pesticide residue calculator, that I showed you that on the very first lecture, recorded lecture. This is something that you can use in order to check your foods that you commonly consume to see if anything is potentially something that could cross a threshold, but very, very unlikely. All right, table 12.3 helps you to get an idea of how we can reduce our exposure to pesticides overall. Number one, wash them. And what do you need in order to wash them? Water. You do not need to buy any type of antibacterial or produce wash. Nothing like that is required in order to make your vegetables cleaner or maybe less pesticides on them or less bacteria on them. No, just running water, scrub them, and it's going to be just as effective than any type of product that you could buy out there. If you are concerned about a particular type, if you peel and trim them, remember you're not going to get that pesticide on it. It could reduce your exposure to any type of bacteria that if it was used by maybe manure or a type of natural fertilizer, helps to reduce that exposure. Trimming the fat, because a lot of chemicals are stored in the fat of animals, so that could also be healthier for you, and it could help to reduce any type of chemical contaminant accumulation exposure. Selective variety. So a variety helps to ensure that not only you're getting a variety of nutrients, but also a variety of any type of potential residue from pesticides. And remember, it's the consistent accumulation that eventually could count if you were to consume a large amount of it. You could, I hate this part in here, I would delete it myself, choose organic, because potentially organic could have less synthetic pesticides, but remember, synthetic and natural, it's just one does not mean that the other is safe. Plus, our body does not recognize the difference between the natural structure versus the synthetic structure of a chemical, so it's going to respond to it in the same way, and the synthetics are made in the same way as the natural ones do. Remember, natural does not equate to safe. You can take poison ivy, it is completely natural, but do not go rolling around in it. You're going to get some adverse effects. Insect repellent, you can definitely understand how those chemicals, if you were to use them over and over, may be a concern. Want to read that label for who it is safe for, what age groups, and if it is a concern, how often that use of that chemical and where you're spraying it at. Is it in a closed environment or outside? Could be potentially harmful, but again, not as likely for the average consumer. Environmental contaminants in fish. There's a lot of confusion regarding the risks and the benefits of consuming fish. We know on one hand that fish tends to be a healthy, lean protein, has really good sources of omega-3 fatty acids in it, which is good for your immune system, your brain functioning, and development, and then also for your heart health. However, we do know that some fish tend to accumulate higher amounts of chemicals in it, like mercury for one, and also polychlorinated biphenyls, and that's PCBs in fish. That's another industrial runoff. They tend to accumulate in that fish tissue, tend to be more concentrated in some of the fat tissue, and especially those larger fish. What can we do? We can choose fish species that are smaller than some of the larger ones. What are the large ones? Shark, swordfish, tilefish, for just a few to name. What's smaller? Certain types of tuna that we do have smaller species of it. Some tuna are very, very large, so you have to look at the difference between things like bluefin tuna and some of the lighter variations of tuna. What are the recommendations? We still want you to consume fish because it is really healthy for you in a variety of different ways. Up to 2 times per week, depending if you are consuming a larger fish or smaller fish, up to 12 ounces of a low mercury fish, especially if you are compromised, like during pregnancy. You want to avoid some of those really large species of fish, such as these that are listed here, like mackerel, king mackerel specifically. When it comes to the other types, really, I hate that it gave you even recommendations here because it really depends on where that fish was harvested, and that's something that is easy to look up and get a little bit more information because fish is such a great option when it comes to other types of health properties. All right, so U.S. adults do not eat enough fish. We see that the average consumption is about 5 ounces of seafood per week, and that's generous. I think around 80% of that 5 ounces is actually shrimp, canned tuna, salmon, and other types of white fish like tilapia. These tend to be very low in those environmental contaminants. They are a very small species. So their overall benefits of consuming fish twice per week outweigh any potential risk. And most people can consume well over the 2 servings per week without any needs of concern. All right, so this says a critical thinking real quick. Mercury in fish. The wild Alaska salmon is a top choice among types of fish based on its high nutritional value, meaning that it has great sources of omega-3 fatty acids and is also low in mercury levels. The question is, what types of fish have the highest levels of mercury? So you want to go back and make sure that you're able to repeat those types of larger fish varieties that we need to be more concerned about during times of vulnerability like pregnancy, breastfeeding, immunocompromised medical treatment. All right, farm to fork real quick. I'm not going to read over this for you, but I think this is very informative when it comes to thinking about all of the variations of food production from growth to food prep. How can we store that food? How can we also prepare the food in order to preserve nutritional quality and also reduce any type of contamination exposure? Now, it's a scary thought to ever think that our food supply could be used as a terroristic act, but that's what agroterrorism is. And even though the U.S. hasn't ever experienced this, it's still something that we have to be concerned with and make sure that we have some programs out there like the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Responsible Act that help to provide us with organizations and resources like the Food Safety and Modernization Act that help to provide a defensive position and program to help establish more safety protocols when it comes to getting our food from different resources into our markets before we get them home, because we want to make sure that we don't have some type of bacteria, chemical, or pathogen that's it's put into our food supply, especially a food staple like pasta, bread, rice, or some of our produce too. So we need to just understand that what agroterrorism is, that we do have our food supply that sustains human life and everybody has to consume. And we do have some programs out there, like the ones you see on here, the Bioterrorism Act and FSMA, out there in order to put in steps and procedures and protocols out there to help keep our food continue to be one of the safest, if not the safest, food supplies out there.